Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 1:10. We will finish at 2:10 p.m. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the NDP government established a Labour Management Review Committee to review the state of our province's labour laws and to make recommendations to the government on any changes. My question, by the way, Mr. Speaker, is to the acting Premier. I should have mentioned that. Mr. Speaker, the leader of the Liberal Party at the time said that if he was ever given the chance, he would strike or get rid of that committee, and I'll table that report for the benefit of the House. Mr. Speaker, my question to the acting Premier, why did the new government's labour law changes leave the Labour Management Review Committee untouched?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the question from the honourable member. We are making changes currently to a number of different labour bills, and in fact we have consulted with the Labour Management Review Committee on one of those particular changes, and we appreciate their input. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that answer. Mr. Speaker, one of the big problems with the Labour Management Review Committee, the powerful committee that the previous government set up to recommend changes to labour laws, is that it excluded non-unionized employers, which, by the way, is about 70% of the employers of our province. Mr. Speaker, a vast majority. Perhaps that's why, when he was in opposition, the leader of the Liberal Party said that this is the biggest problem that he has with the NDP's labour laws. And in fact, he said in this House, one of the things I think is the biggest problem with this piece of legislation, quite frankly, is the Labour Management Review Committee. So I understand the government is new and is taking its time, but since this is one of the now Premier's biggest problems, I'd like to ask the acting Premier, now that they are in government, why didn't they do what they said they would do and at least add non-unionized employers to the all-powerful Labour Management Review Committee?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. As the member can well appreciate, having been Chief of Staff to a new government, we've come into the House after about a month of being ministers. We have put forward 3 bills. They are important bills. They will not be the end of the labour legislation that this government will look at, but certainly we felt these were our 3 priorities for right now. Thank you.
Leader of the Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that answer. I will say that we would see those 3 bills as 3 opportunities missed to actually make this correction, a correction that the leader and our now Premier said was the biggest problem he had with our labour laws. Mr. Speaker, in their throne speech, the new government said that they wanted to focus on the needs of small business. Small businesses like egg studios, for example, who are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars defending themselves in the wake of the first contract arbitration that they face. Mr. Speaker, they did not have a say in the design of these laws in the first place because, as a previously non-unionized employer, they were excluded from any review or recommendations about changes of the province's labour laws by the previous government. This is something that the new government could have done at least 3 times, by the minister's admission in this session, to address an obvious unfairness that exists in the labour laws. So I will ask the minister, when does the government intend to address this problem that the Premier said was the biggest problem in labour laws in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would note for the member opposite that the LMRC did not achieve consensus on first contract arbitration. So to suggest that that they approved, that the entire membership of that particular committee approved of the government's handling of first contract arbitration would be misleading. It would also be misleading, as the member opposite has done, to suggest that the case in question was solely about first contract arbitration. In fact, the issues that are before the courts are in fact about certification and not about arbitration. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is also to the Minister of Labour. Mr. Speaker, for the last number of months and probably the last number of years, we've been hearing from the Liberal Party telling us that small and medium-sized business were the backbone of the economy in the province, Mr. Speaker. But recently, they've been, with actions in this House, we see give with one hand, take it away with the other, Mr. Speaker. So I would like to ask the Minister, would she kindly table the documents and consultation with small business owners about the effect of paying for a new stat holiday?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do thank the member opposite for the question. Of course, there was recently a very extensive consultation carried out here in Nova Scotia. Thank you, Minister, for that question. That particular consultation was called an election campaign, and we all went door to door and we talked to people about what issues they were concerned about. And I have to say that most of the feedback that I received about the February holiday was that people wanted it. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
So I guess, Mr. Speaker, she didn't consult and she has nothing to table. So that's fine, Mr. Speaker. But you know, in these issues, some of the folks that they're going to hurt are small businesses, and particularly in the service industry, Mr. Speaker, because as I've noticed and I've stated in speeches in this House before, that time of year is a particularly slow time. So, Speaker, my question to that minister, will she assure workers and their families that governments will not freeze the minimum wage order in an effort to make nice with business and hurt the people who need this the most?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the minister knows, the former minister knows, there is a process in place for increasing the minimum wage. It's been in place since, I think, 2011. There were changes introduced, and at this time there are no changes contemplated. Thank you.
My apologies. The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My final supplementary, I would like to ask the acting Premier, who has been a large proponent of increasing statutory holidays, Mr. Speaker, and we all know that there's no free lunch. So I want to ask the acting Premier very directly, why will she not say today in this House definitively that this government will protect the minimum wage order and will not freeze or entertain any kind of wage exemption on minimum wage?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not quite sure how the minister, the Deputy Premier, could have refused to answer when she hadn't been asked a question yet. So I don't really understand that particular part of the question. But I will say, Mr. Speaker, that there are no plans at this time to take the action that the minister, the former member, the former minister, the current member had discussed. Thank you.
Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Acting Premier. Nova Scotia's economy lost 2,600 full-time jobs over the past year, from November 2012 to November 2013, according to the most recent reports, and I'll table that for the benefit of the House. Mr. Speaker, in opposition, the Liberal Party was very critical of the NDP record on jobs. I'd like to ask the Acting Premier, when will this government release its own plan to get our economy going again and create jobs for unemployed Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the opposition. Mr. Premier, this is an issue that is of great concern to us in the government side of the House. We are certainly and did in opposition and continue to watch the numbers and to see the impact on unemployment, and to see the impact on our economy, and as finance critic as well, or minister, seeing the impact on our budget. What I'd like to do, Mr. Speaker, is turn the question over to our Minister of Economic Development, because we have many plans to address the problems.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think today was a great example of what our government has been doing with announcing 51 companies that are receiving funding under Productivity and Innovation Voucher Program. Mr. Speaker, these were companies from communities throughout Nova Scotia, small, medium-sized companies, and those are the types of investments that Nova Scotians are looking to see from the government. As well, on top of that, we've already indicated a review is taking place of the economic development tools that we use, and as well, changes are coming to the credit union small business program, which we have seen great success from and hope to see much more success in the future. Merci.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the answer. I will say, if creating jobs for Nova Scotians was a priority for the government, we'd actually see a plan to create jobs, an all-encompassing plan to create jobs, and not an attempt to take credit for programs that have been in place long before this government came into power. Mr. Speaker, we have a number of bills on the order paper. None of them represents a specific plan to get Nova Scotians working again, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, it's not a priority for the government. Creating a February holiday might be a priority, because that's on the order paper. Even appointing a chief of protocol appears to be a priority for the government, Mr. Speaker. But 2,600 Nova Scotians lost their jobs in the last 12 months. We're here in this House. There's no plan to create new jobs, the biggest issue that Nova Scotians are facing. My question, Mr. Speaker, to the Acting Premier, why isn't creating jobs for Nova Scotians a higher priority for this government?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Mr. Speaker, again, when you look today at the 51 companies that were here in the legislature, I'm at a loss to understand why the Leader of the Opposition would not want to stand and recognize the important investment that the government has made in these companies. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, the people of Nova Scotia clearly said that they wanted to see accountability, and accountability in how monies were being invested by our department, by the government, which is why we've undertaken that much-needed review to ensure we have the proper economic development tools, and we're also waiting for the results of the Ray Ivany Commission on the rural economy, which will certainly as well give us a sense of exactly where we should be focusing our efforts to grow the economy of Nova Scotia.
Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned, 2,600 Nova Scotians lost their job in the last 12 months. Mr. Speaker, they are not looking forward to more studies and more research and more consultations. They need a plan today, Mr. Speaker. They saw a party in opposition that was so critical of the NDP for all the jobs that were lost under their administration. They correctly or assumedly thought a party that was so critical of another would have some plans of its own and would be addressing their needs in this, their first session of a new government, Mr. Speaker, but there's nothing here. that represents a jobs plan for those 2,600 Nova Scotia families or the tens of thousands of others that are unemployed. Mr. Speaker, this is the great issue that we all hope we'd be dealing with in this session, and now we see that we're not. So if 2,600 jobs is not enough of a reason for the government to come forward with a plan to get our economy going, my question to the acting premier, Mr. Speaker, is how many more jobs have to be lost before we see a plan from this government to turn our economy around?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity as well to answer on this question. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member began his question by saying there are too many plans and people don't want to wait for more plans, and then he demanded a job creation plan. I think it's important to note. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I have every confidence in the approach that we're taking on this side of the House, that our government understands the issue, that we understand the economic pressures that Nova Scotia is under, and that we are doing everything possible to mitigate it under those circumstances.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Economic Development and Tourism. Mr. Speaker, the absence of an international ferry in Yarmouth cost the region dearly. It cost the region dearly in jobs and in businesses and, Mr. Speaker, in human terms. The announcement in mid-November that a deal had been made for a new ferry restored hope to many, many people. But recent media stories have many people confused in the southwest area. So my question to the minister, can the minister explain why the government did not make the first payment to the company responsible for bringing the ferry service back to Yarmouth?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can certainly say that I agree with the member opposite of the devastating impact that the cancellation of the Yarmouth ferry has had, not only the people of Yarmouth, but certainly, Mr. Speaker, throughout our entire province. In fact, we even saw that tour bus traffic on Cape Breton Island was reduced after the loss of the ferry service. So this truly had an impact throughout our entire province. The deal that we were able to negotiate with our partners to restore the ferry service back in November set out a number of conditions which had to be met prior to taxpayers' money being released. At this point, we continue to work with the company, STM Quest, and in the hopes that they are going to continue to meet those deadlines and those requirements so that we can make those investments and see that ferry service running again in 2014. Merci.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the minister for that answer. But also, he also knows that the joint venture company, STM Quest, is scheduled to begin operating that ferry service between Portland, Maine, and Yarmouth in May. That's just a very few short months away. And as we speak, many of the key marketing deadlines have been missed or are about to be missed. Bus tour schedules, other important tourism initiatives. So my next question to the minister, what is the Department of Economic Development and Tourism doing to ensure that all conditions of the ferry deal are being met and that the people of southwest Nova Scotia are not disappointed yet again?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Mr. Speaker, in this case, when we looked at the initial letter of offer, some of the changes that were made to that letter of offer, which I think is what Nova Scotians have asked for, is that as part of this agreement, the company needs to meet certain expectations before they receive government money. Mr. Speaker, I think we saw too many times in the past where that was the exact opposite, where the government money was what went first, and then hopefully things were going to happen afterwards. So in this case, obviously, we've done our best to protect taxpayers and ensure that the company is going to meet those standards first, which we continue to work with them and become very hopeful of that. I as well had the opportunity to attend the annual meeting of the Tourism Industry Association of Nova Scotia, and during that time I was happy to announce that our department had granted an additional $1 million to the Nova Scotia Tourism Agency to do marketing and promotion in the eastern United States, which no question will assist the ferry service as well.
Honourable House Leader for the official opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And obviously, it is very important that this ferry be up and running in May for the whole economy of Southwest Nova Scotia, especially the tourist economy. Media reports have indicated the minister has been writing the company about how the government will respond should the partners miss deadlines. But really, my question is more of a comment to the minister, is to simply let's get on with it. Let's get everything signed. Let's get the announcements done. Let's get the advertising done so we make sure that Nova Scotians will see that tourism traffic come across the Yarmouth Ferry as soon as possible.
The Honourable Minister for Economic Development and Tourism.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I can tell you there is no greater champion in our government to see this ferry service restored than the Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, what I would like to say to the honourable member is at this point, the province of Nova Scotia has met all of its obligations. At this point, for the ferry service to be resumed, the obligations now rest with STM Quest for them to meet their obligations. But from our perspective, the people of Nova Scotia have done everything possible to make this ferry service become a reality in 2014. Merci.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Acting Premier. Mr. Speaker, with an RCMP investigation underway into Senate expenses and possible misuse of taxpayers' money, polls show the majority of Canadians want the Senate abolished, something the NDP has long advocated for. Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia's recent presentation to the Supreme Court reference that the Harper government has initiated, we spoke to the process, saying that Nova Scotia feels the abolition of the agreement, the abolition of the Senate would require agreement of 10 provinces. However, we did not speak to what the province's position is with respect to the future of the Senate. So my question to the Acting Premier is this: what is the government's position on abolishing the Senate?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to address this very issue just briefly with the media earlier, and I'm sure that the Premier would be happy to address this further for the Leader of the NDP. But the Premier has made it very clear in previous statements that we continue to see the Senate as an institution, an important body for the people of Nova Scotia. When we look at the growth in representation from members of Parliament in Ontario and in the Western provinces, it continues to dilute the influence of our members on the federal stage, whereas the Senate gives us a guaranteed level of representation. The Premier has also indicated that he is supportive of an elected Senate, but the costs of those elections should be borne by the federal government, not the people of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question again is for the Acting Premier. Mr. Speaker, in recent weeks, the legislatures of both Manitoba and Saskatchewan have passed motions calling for the abolition of the Senate. And to quote the Premier of Saskatchewan, when a building is falling down, sometimes you can't save it. Sometimes you've got to knock it down completely and rebuild. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Acting Premier, aside from rewarding longtime Liberal supporters with expensive trips and lucrative paychecks, can the Acting Premier provide a sound explanation for why Nova Scotians should not join with other provinces in calling for an end to the Senate?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the question again from the opposition about the Senate. Mr. Speaker, there's no question that having a greater representation for Nova Scotia in the Senate is a benefit to us in terms of our influence in the country. And further to that, Mr. Speaker, although there has been obviously a lot of trouble and scandal in the Senate, we have some very hard-working senators, and I think it's worth noting. We've had senators that have led some very important studies. Mr. Speaker, we also don't believe that you make these kind of decisions based on a resolution in the House or that sort of way. You don't amend history. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think the members in Saskatchewan and Manitoba would be very surprised that they shouldn't have passed that resolution in their houses. Mr. Speaker, in 2012, Nova Scotian senators cost taxpayers, the 10 senators from Nova Scotia cost taxpayers $2.3 million for their expenses alone, and $1.4 million in salaries. Mr. Speaker, in fact, Canada's third and fourth most expensive senators were from Nova Scotia. Liberal Senator Terry Mercer and Liberal Senator James Cowan, respectively. So, Mr. Speaker, my question again is for the acting Premier. Does she really think $3.7 million for 10 senators was taxpayer money well spent?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And although we're here to talk about the Senate at the moment in this question, I think there are a lot of things that you could question about spending. And I would go back to the expenditure that was made to political staffers by the NDP after the election was over, increasing the amount of money spent to political staffers. Mr. Speaker, those are very difficult decisions that, to bring that up. Mr. Speaker, while we're talking about the Senate, and I mentioned we have very good senators that are doing hard work, I think it's a good time to recognize Senator Don Oliver, Gerald Comeau, who both are retiring I think this year. And in addition to that, Kevin Ogilvie, who's one of our Nova Scotia senators who was just recognized with a scientific award. We have some very illustrious and hard-working people on the Senate, and I think that the cost of democracy is just that, just as the cost of an election. We run elections in this province. You cannot complain about the fact that we have a democracy.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, a family in my constituency has been waiting since 2011, March 2011 to be exact, for their son to access the services provided by the province's early intensive behavioural intervention program. Their son is now 4 years old, and still no end in sight. My question to the Minister through you, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister make changes to address the wait times for the EIBI program?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly concur with the health critic opposite that the EIBI program is extremely valuable to all Nova Scotians. At the present time, we do have inconsistencies of wait times across Nova Scotia, and some of these are being addressed every year, but the timeliness of this program for young children is absolutely critical. We committed to doing a review of all of the recommendations for the autism strategy, and as part of reviewing those 51 recommendations, reviewing as well wait times for EIBI is part of that consideration.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer. This family has two choices, unfortunately. Either send their son to school next year and become ineligible for the program, or keep him home another year and wait for the services. This is an impossible choice for this family, and one they should not be forced to make. The EIBI program was expanded so all eligible children will be offered the treatment. My question, this is obviously not the case. What can the Minister say to ease the anxiety of families who have been unfairly put in this very difficult position?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know in some of the districts across Nova Scotia, there are training programs for parents that will assist them in support and helping the child until they actually get to meet a therapist. And it's obvious in this district, perhaps that wait list and perhaps even for parental instruction is still very limited. But again, this program is one very important to both the minister and this party that have advocated long and hard and moved autism from $0 to $4 million to $8 million, and doing what we can to support parents and children is in fact critical to that child's future.
The honourable member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again I thank the minister for that answer, and I know that he's very familiar with this file. There are serious differences in wait times for the EIBI program between district health authorities. This program is to be based on the age of the child, but if the family in my constituency were to move to a different health authority mere miles away, they may not have this problem. My question to the minister: what will the minister do to address the wait time disparity between health authorities, and how can he assure children are seen based on their age?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we know that this is going to continue to be an enormous challenge for our government, as now we're discovering that about 1 in 76 children do have some degree of autism along the spectrum, and trying to level out the wait times across Nova Scotia is indeed one of our challenges. And I would certainly encourage the health critic for the opposition to in fact give me this particular case and see if in fact if the Capital District and the department can find some solution.
Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, my question is to the acting premier. Mr. Speaker, an unelected, unaccountable Senate is not useful to Nova Scotians. It only sits... Mr. Speaker, I hear members saying that this is boring. Well, Mr. Speaker, to the majority of Nova Scotians watching the Senate, and the excesses and the abuses in the Senate are not boring, Mr. Speaker. And they expect answers from that government. So, Mr. Speaker, an unelected, unaccountable Senate is not useful to Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, that Senate sits on average just 90 days a year. It costs the taxpayers over $90 million annually to run. So, Mr. Speaker, if it makes sense for Nova Scotia to have done away with its upper chamber in 1928, can the acting premier honestly say that its federal counterpart is not past its best before date?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I said in my answer to the previous question, I think that we have to look at the value of the Senate, especially to a small province like Nova Scotia. Having the representation that we do at the Senate is very important. And I would add, Mr. Speaker, if this issue was so pressing to the NDP party, why did that caucus not raise it when they were in government?
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, unelected and unaccountable senators represent the parties that appoint them, not their regions or the Canadian people. And Canadians and Nova Scotians know that only too well. So, Mr. Speaker, does the acting premier really think that appointed senators is actually democracy at work?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. And again, I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, again, the members that I've mentioned, the retiring members of the Senate and the members that are there today represent all Nova Scotians. Their work is on behalf of the Acadian community, like Gerald Camol, and each one of them represent their communities. So I think that the member opposite is missing the point in trying to get on a bandwagon that she should have been on when she was a minister in the government.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know where the former member was, when the former government was in place. We have been opposed to the abolition. We have been in support of the abolition of the Senate for many, many years, and that has been the position of the New Democratic Party, and it will continue to be, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, mature parliamentary democracies around the world either have already or are moving away from undemocratic, unelected, unrepresentative houses of privilege and patronage. And so my question to the acting premier, what makes our Senate, in her mind, a special case where we can continue to put up with these undemocratic institutions?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, Nova Scotia is a very small province in Canada. Our population is declining, and if the NDP party wanted to reinvent the Senate, I can guarantee you we would not be able to get the representation that we have today in any kind of new body. So blowing up the Senate is not going to in any way enhance the strength of Nova Scotia within the Dominion of Canada. And for that reason, I think it's far better to work with the system we have and try and improve it rather than lose our position as a province and the strength and the voice that it gives us as a province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, an issue long overlooked by the former government was the service gap for children between 16 and 18 years of age under the Children and Family Services Act. The Auditor General concluded the Act was out of date. The All-Party Standing Committee on Community Services voted in favour of having the Act updated, and the former Liberal critic for Community Services has voiced her support. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Community Services is, has the Minister had consultation in her department about making changes to the Act?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in opposition, the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education said, continuing to ignore the needs of children between the ages of 16 and 18 is completely unacceptable. And I'll table that document, Mr. Speaker. Again, my question, does the Minister agree with their Cabinet colleague that this is not acceptable?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Part of my mandate is to actually open up the Act and to look at many different variables of the Act, which in the past 15 years have had 8 reports from different committees that have all been turned down. The time will be now, within the next 4 years, where that Act will be open. That part of the Act will be reviewed, as well as other areas, such as the definition of neglect. My background warrants that. I have always advocated for the Act to be reopened and to looked at so that we can bring it up to date with the issues that are prevalent to families in crisis now.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate that. We need to do everything we can to protect our most vulnerable people. The youth in this province has slipped through the cracks for far too long because they're not able to receive the services they need. This change is long overdue. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General commented on his department's response to his recommendation and said it's clear the department does not intend to initiate a revision of the legislation. So my final question is, will the Minister stand up for children and commit to introducing amendments to the Children and Family Services Act in this session?
The Honourable Minister Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, it will be a proud day when I bring the amendments forward in this House. It is something as a community member, certainly advocated long and for, and I have stood and built a career in my professional life on advocating for children in crisis and in care. And that lens has not changed now that I am the Minister of Community Services. It will be amended. It will be changed. I'm looking at legislation within the next year and a half.
The Honourable House Leader for the NDP.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Acting Premier. You know, Mr. Speaker, in June of this year, the four Atlantic Premiers initiated a Pan-Atlantic initiative aiming at determining the impact of recent changes by the federal government in the EI program, or Employment Insurance Program, Mr. Speaker. Now, last week, Mr. Speaker, we learned that the new Liberal government ordered CUPE's Danny Kavanagh removed from his position on the EI panel, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, if Mr. Kavanagh is representative of a large portion of Nova Scotia workers, which we know he is, and he has the professional background and expertise to speak on EI issues, Speaker, so I want to ask the Acting Premier, what is it about Mr. Kavanagh that made his participation on this panel so egregious to that government?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. Mr. Speaker, the EI review that's going on, the panel that's looking at this, had several phases, and we really want to thank Mr. Kavanagh for his help in phase one, because he had a great deal to do with what the consultation is going to look like. But, Mr. Speaker, the reason for the change in the composition of the panel really has to do with our reliance on seasonal industries and the impact of these EI changes on seasonal industries. And that was why the current representative that's going around the province on that panel is somebody from the tourism industry.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party on his first supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, in correspondence to Mr. Kavanagh, it was stated Nova Scotia will be identifying a new Nova Scotian representative, as the Deputy Premier said, for the panel for the next phase of this initiative. And she just said it was from tourism. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to give you a little background on Mr. Kavanagh. He represents seasonal workers, Mr. Speaker. The people who drive our school buses, the men and women, the women and men that work in our nursing homes, the women and men that clear our winter roads, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Kavanagh himself is a small business operator. So all of these people will be affected by the use of this EI program. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Acting Premier, given his background, why was he removed?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think it is important to note that there were several phases in this consultation, and this is something that was started at the Council of Premiers. As we know, the Atlantic Premiers set out and determined that we would look at the impact across the Maritimes. So this is a very important exercise. Of course, we wouldn't be at this juncture if it weren't for the punitive changes brought forth by the Harper government, which we all, I think, will agree were wrong for this province. I think that's where we can all agree. However, Mr. Speaker, we believe that it's best to engage more Nova Scotians, and that by having a representative of the tourism industry, somebody who is actually the president now of the Tourism Industry Association, that really reaches out to so many of the seasonal workers that are engaged in tourism and in our rural areas of the province as well.
Honourable House Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, you know somebody from the tourism industry speaks for that industry, but it's that lone industry where I would contend, Mr. Speaker, that Mr. Kavanagh spoke for many people across the spectrum. But you know, this is really gets to the point of who this Premier hires and fires, Mr. Speaker. So to be blunt, I'm confused on what this government considers the proper credentials. So I want to ask the Acting Premier, and I think all Nova Scotians are wondering, is how is Glennie Langell qualified for her job, but Mr. Kavanagh is not for his?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, again, I think that it's important to say that Mr. Kavanagh has been thanked for his participation, and that QP will be invited to continue to make representations as well throughout this process. That's the important part in this question, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Halifax, Chebucto.
Mr. Speaker, this is a question for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, just last month, the United States FDA took preliminary steps to ban trans fats, artery clogging chemicals that result in 20,000 heart attacks as well as 7,000 deaths in heart disease each year in the United States. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Health inform the House on what's being done in this province to limit and ultimately ban trans fats? Mr. Speaker, it is important that this province follow the lead of the United States and lead Canada on this front. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much for the question. Mr. Speaker, I want to first of all commend one of my colleagues opposite, a member for Sydney, and I have to get Whitney Pierre, sorry. I've been getting the new names down here yet, but I know a number of years ago he was involved with a petition urging government of the day to look at perhaps, if not a ban, a reducing of trans fat. So I want to acknowledge that. I know that in the department this is an important issue, and it's one that I know in regards to the Nova Scotia school policy, the nutrition policy, that in fact to make a reduction in all foods purchased that have no or limited amounts of trans fats, and the same way in the early childhood years in our preschool to have a dramatic reduction of trans fats. So this is very much as well in the Thrive program regarding our schools, our universities, our colleges, to be able to have reduced trans fats in our food. And I know that, to finish off with, the more that Nova Scotians, in fact, want less trans fats in their food, this will, in fact, impact on food processors as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Economic Development and Tourism. And my question is about a Pictou County company named Maritime Steel. Now, I know that the Minister is familiar with Maritime Steel because he referenced it in his comments to me last week. So my question today is quite simple. Has the Minister had a chance to familiarize himself with the situation at Maritime Steel?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Obviously, our government is open to talking with all businesses that want to do business in this province and grow in this province. My staff have had various conversations with the proprietor of Maritime Steel and have clearly indicated what requirements that they would have to have prior to being able to have any further discussions. So at this time, we continue to await for the proprietor to be able to supply us with the requested information and commitments.
The honourable member for Pictou East on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer. I'm happy to hear that the department staff is reaching out to Maritime Steel, because it's been over a year now that the workers have been strung along in many ways for political reasons. Mr. Speaker, the NDP government effectively slammed the door on Maritime Steel by requesting information, then requesting more information, and then only after a year of doing this decided to ask for a business plan, only to use to request more information. My point, Mr. Speaker, is that while all this takes place, the workers are losing hope, they are running out of EI, and are facing the prospects of moving away. So we're losing jobs in rural Nova Scotia, and it's beyond the point of desperation for these Maritime Steel workers. These are good jobs in rural Nova Scotia, so my question today for the Minister is, will he commit to meeting with the owners and workers of Maritime Steel and outline the process that he expects to be followed.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, we're certainly open to hearing suggestions on how to move maritime steel forward. But at the end of the day, we need to ensure that if we are going to be asked to make investments, that we are protecting taxpayers, something which I know the leader of the Honourable Member's Party has been very vocal about. Therefore, the Department has already clearly communicated to the proprietor as to what information they would require before being able to properly assess any requests for public funds to assist with that business. I can tell you that we'd certainly be more than happy to receive that information and to be able to work and see what ways that we could possibly see the reopening of that company and jobs in rural Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I again thank the Minister for his answer. Mr. Speaker, the workers are suffering tremendous hardship. The workers at Maritime Steel would employ our skilled labour, and they are good jobs filled by the type of residents that Nova Scotia needs. The NDP government seemed quite content to keep asking for information and then sitting back and waiting. And that may have been fine for them at that time, but it's not a reasonable expectation for the workers to just continue to wait. The workers are facing real deadlines, and they can't just wait. The workers face bill payments and other types of deadlines. So I would ask the Minister if he would be willing to commit to book a couple hours in his busy schedule and sit down in a timely fashion and meet with the workers and the owner of Maritime Steel, possibly within the month.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Speaker. And there's nothing more unfortunate than when workers are left in a situation where they don't know who to believe anymore. And I think Maritime Steel is an unfortunate example of that. As the member referenced, the political realities of Pictou County at the time. As such, unfortunately, it's the workers who have been left to wait. We have made it very clear in communications with the owner of Maritime Steel as to what exact information is required, what financial commitments has to be provided to the department before we are prepared to look at making an investment on behalf of the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, something which I believe the Leader of the Opposition should certainly support that approach. But certainly I'm more than happy to meet with the owner and meet with representatives, and certainly welcome the members of the opposition from that area to be part of those meetings as well.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on November 6th, the Department of Environment issued a directive to Northern Pulp to allow the department to closely monitor the company's progress on meeting the emission limits outlined in its operating approval. Because the company was exceeding the operating permit levels 15% of the time. This directive specifically requires monthly reporting on total reduced sulfur emissions and detailed descriptions of the work being done on the equipment to further reduce emissions. My question, Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister of Environment, has the department received the monthly report for November? And if you have, what did the November data reveal? Will the Minister make those monthly reports public as well?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. That directive was one of the first initiatives that took place after I became Minister of the Environment. Representing the riding of Antigonish, neighbouring riding to Pictou region, I certainly am familiar with the challenges that the residents of that area face with respect to the ongoing concerns that they have in this regard. But to answer the member's question specifically, we did recently receive the first set of test results. I don't have the detailed data right here, but generally speaking, the results were good indicating that there was a significant reduction in total reduced sulfur emissions, but I don't have the specific data here, but I will certainly look into getting the detailed results and making those available.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for those answers. The people of Pictou West are concerned about the effects of air pollution from northern pulp on their health, given that this facility is a major contributor of fine particulate matter of air pollution. As I am sure you are aware, particulate matter is now officially recognized as a carcinogenic to humans by the World Health Organization's Specialized Cancer Agency, the International Agency for Research on Canada. In addition, the U.S. EPA cites scientific studies that attribute fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, to a variety of negative health outcomes, including, but not limited to, heart attacks, asthma, decreased lung function, and increased respiratory symptoms. Children are particularly sensitive to these fine particulate matter pollution, and fine particulate matter settles on the soil and water, causing environmental damage. My question, Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister of Environment is the Minister confident his department is doing all it can to protect the citizens and the environment from the harmful effects of PM 2.5? And does the department have a universal standard for particular matter, specifically, once again, the PM 2.5, that may be emitted by any one industrial facility?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With respect to the ongoing concerns for the residents of Pictou, and I don't believe it's limited to the residents of Pictou West, I believe Pictou East and all of Pictou County share those concerns. What I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that with respect to this particular operation, they are currently operating with a temporary approval that is up for consideration in April of the new year. And as we continue to put the environment and the concerns and the health of the citizens of Nova Scotia first, with respect to the review of the approval situation, granted to this organization, we certainly look at all aspects of the operation as it relates to the environment, and they will be considered as part of the approval process leading up to any action taken on that April renewal.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for your answers. The second directive issued to Northern Pulp by NSE on March 8, 2013 required the mill to address the issue of particulate matter emissions. To do so, Northern Pulp identified it would need to install a new piece of equipment, an electrostatic precipitator. The anticipated date of installation of this equipment is sometime in 2015. Since directives are issued by NSE for non-compliance to operating permit conditions of a facility, it would appear that this second directive was in response to Northern Pulp's exceeding its permitted values of particulate matter emissions. And since the World Health Organization has declared particulate matter as carcinogenic to humans, it's a deeply concern of mine. Yes, not just for Pictou West, but all of Pictou County and beyond. And during the election campaign, the Premier signed a declaration that said, a Liberal government will insist on aggressive monitoring of the emissions from the plant, that a system for reporting this information to the community will be put in place, and any further assistance to the plant will be based on cleaning up the air emissions, and I will table that document. My question, Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister of Environment. Sorry. Will the Minister commit today that Delivery on the Premier's election promise to aggressive monitor the amounts of a known carcinogen into the air, land and water, and not make Pictou residents and beyond wait 2 years for action.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, again, I thank the member opposite for raising these concerns in the House on behalf of her constituents. The issue here is, as mentioned, we've already initiated and started taking action with respect to the Premier's stated commitments, as was indicated by our third directive to this particular operation, I think demonstrating our concern and our interest in monitoring and ensuring the qualities and the standards are being met. With respect to where we go from here, as already indicated, this particular operation is up for renewal of their environmental approvals, industrial approval, and that is scheduled to take place in April of 2014, and we are going through that process right now.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to orders of the day. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, with the concurrence of the House under government business, today we had a private member's bill which was introduced by the Honourable Member for Pictou East. It's bill number 27. With the consent of the House, I would ask that this bill be added to today's order paper for consideration of second reading of private members' bills. What?
All in favor of the motion? Or is it agreed? Thank you. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleagues for that. With that